ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. The Religious Studies Department of Mount St. Vincent University, with the sponsorship of the Sisters of Charity, is pleased to offer the 11th Annual Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series and to bring this time to the Mount and to our area an outstanding scholar of Christian thought on social justice in the person of Dr. Peter Paris. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to continue our custom of recalling at the opening session the origin and purpose of the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. I would ask Sister Maria Sutherland, Superior of the Halifax Province of the Sisters of Charity, to do this for us. Sister Maria.
Good evening, and welcome to this annual Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. The Elizabeth Seton Lectures began in 1978 with the establishment of an endowment fund for this purpose by the Halifax Province of the Sisters of Charity. The decision to take this action was made in response to a proposal from the Sisters of Charity on the faculty of Mount St. Vincent University, who recommended that we sponsor such a program with the general theme of Christian presence in our world, past, present, and future. The statement of the university's aims, philosophy, and objectives describes the Mount as rooted in a Catholic tradition marked by a strong commitment to understanding the truth, intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. We believed in 1978, and we still believe, that these lectures would be a tangible evidence of our desire to contribute toward providing at Mount St. Vincent an environment where these objectives can be achieved. We are sure that this year's lecturer, Dr. Peter Paris, an ordained Baptist minister and an internationally known expert on ethics and social justice issues, will make a very special contribution to giving life to this description of the university. As representative of the Sisters of Charity this evening, Dr. Paris, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. Who is this woman whose name we have chosen to give to these lectures? Elizabeth Ann Seton, known to Sisters of Charity as Mother Seton, is well known to many of you who have been associated with us over the years. But for those who have not yet met her, allow me just the briefest introduction. She was born Elizabeth Ann Bailey in 1774, probably in New York, into a wealthy Episcopalian family. Her mother died when she was not yet 3 years old, and she often lived with her father's relatives in New Rochelle, probably to relieve her stepmother, who had 6 children in the first 8 years of her marriage to Richard Bailey, Elizabeth's father. At 20, in 1794, Elizabeth married William Seton, son of a wealthy merchant, and in time 5 children were born to them. Her married life was interrupted by the illness and death of her husband, and in her 30th year she was left a widow, the family fortunes gone, and 5 children in her care. It was at this time of trial that Elizabeth came in touch with the Catholic Church, which she entered in 1805, thus aligning herself with the poor and the immigrants of New York. In the years to follow, she became the founder of the Sisters of Charity and a noted educator and leader in the church. Hers was indeed a full and interesting life, even within the relatively short span of her 47 years. She lived as daughter, sister, stepchild, half-sister, wife, mother, widow, single parent, educator, religious. I'm sure there's no one here who cannot identify in some way with Elizabeth Seton's life. And finally, in 1975, she was declared the first native-born American saint of the Catholic Church. I am sure she would listen with interest tonight to Dr. Paris's presentation. Finally, I would like to express our appreciation to the Religious Studies Department of the Mount. Over the years, they have consistently engaged stimulating and enriching speakers to challenge us and to deepen our appreciation of the demands of being Christian in our world. It is with pleasure that the Sisters of Charity once more collaborate with the Religious Studies Department to bring you this opportunity for broadening and deepening our knowledge of Christian teaching and our commitment to a Christian way of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Maria. Friends, it is now my privilege to introduce tonight's topic and speaker. Our topic tonight is Christianity and social justice. Social justice. Can't you find a better title? Nobody will come. I've heard that plaintive cry quite a few times in recent weeks. The sponsors of a conference, a campus lecture, they all want a catchy title, one that will bring in the crowd. And social justice definitely is not a catchy title. It may not be the set of words designed to pack a hall. To be honest, it may very well keep many folks far away. Why is this? I suspect it has to do with the way social justice themes have sometimes been presented to people. Frequently, I have begun a course with the question, what comes to your mind and your heart when I say the word social justice? How are people touched intellectually and emotionally by that often used, perhaps overused phrase? The intellectual responses are interesting. They tend to be abstract. People mention, for example, freedom, rights, liberation, participation, solidarity. But if I say social injustices, the responses are more concrete. They mention hunger, sexism, racism, torture, militarism. But it is the emotional responses that are the most revealing. People mention feelings of frustration, guilt, fear, anger, threat, hopelessness, anxiety. Clearly, there is something about this topic that touches people deeply. We know we should be committed to justice and doing something to bring it about in our world, but we often find the whole topic very confusing, very challenging, and very unattractive. Social justice is a matter that is morally problematic, pastorally delicate, legislatively thorny, constitutionally insecure, ecumenically divisive, medically normless, humanly anguishing, racially provocative, journalistically abused, personally biased, and widely ignored. So social justice demands a most extraordinary discipline of moral thought, one that is penetrating without being impenetrable, humanly compassionate without being morally compromising, legally realistic without being legally positivistic, instructed by other disciplines without being determined by them, informed by tradition without being enslaved by it. And so we are very fortunate to have among us this evening and the whole day tomorrow Dr. Peter Paris, who is especially gifted in helping people to cut through the confusion regarding social justice and Christianity. Dr. Paris is an internationally well-known theologian. Dr. Paris has roots in the black community of Nova Scotia. He was born and went to school in New Glasgow and received both a BA and Master of Divinity from Acadia University. In 1959, he was ordained by the African United Baptist Association of the Atlantic Baptist Convention. After serving as a Baptist pastor and as general and traveling secretary for the student Christian movement in Canada and Nigeria, Dr. Paris moved to Chicago, where he completed his MA and PhD in Ethics and Society at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago. His studies of the independent black churches in the United States confirmed both his decision to remain directly engaged with the larger black community south of the border, and in interesting and subtle ways expressed the influence of his Canadian upbringing. His teaching career has taken Dr. Paris from the University of Chicago to the Howard University School of Religion, to Vanderbilt Divinity School, and finally to Princeton Theological Seminary as Professor of Christian Social Ethics. Dr. Paris' many publications include 3 books: Black Leaders in Conflict, The Social Teaching of the Black Churches, and Justice and the Holy. His professional memberships include the Society of Christian Ethics, the American Academy of Religion, the Society for the Study of Black Religion, the Society for Values in Higher Education, and the American Theological Society. On your behalf, I welcome Dr. Peter Paris and invite him to speak to us of Christianity and social justice.
Good evening, colleagues and friends. Thank you very much, Professor Goulet, for your warm introduction. It is a great honor for me to have been invited to present these lectures this year. I know several of the previous lecturers, but especially I want to mention Professor Rosemary Ruther, because she was a colleague of mine at Howard University for 2 years. And that was a very rich experience for me, and I am delighted that you got to hear her in this lecture series some time ago. I plan to present a general statement tonight about our subject matter and move tomorrow from this kind of generality to more specifics. Eastern mysticism represents a religion that is unconcerned about justice, and Western humanism represents a philosophy that is unconcerned about religion. And I want to talk about both of these in very general terms in the beginning, and then to move again in general historical terms to the foundations for the Black Christian tradition, which from my perspective grounds my perspective on this particular subject matter. Both Eastern mysticism and Western humanism have had important impacts on Christianity. Hence, terms such as Christian mysticism and Christian humanism have developed, indicating something of that impact. Now, both Eastern mysticism and Western humanism deny any integral relationship between Christianity and social justice. Eastern mysticism devalues material being, while Western humanism views the spiritual realm as an illusion. Each bestows ultimate value and meaning on its respective subject matter. Eastern mysticism values eternal spirit, and humanism values the temporality of the body. An ascetic life comprises the moral standard for Eastern mysticism, while the rational principle is the moral guide for Western humanism. In Eastern mysticism, detachment from all temporal, unredeemable matter and absorption into deity is thought to be the only way to truth, beauty, and goodness. In Western humanism, reasoned engagement with humanity is thought to be the only way to human fulfillment. Not surprisingly, they have different anthropological understandings. Eastern mysticism emphasizes an immortal soul seeking escape from its entrapment in a mortal body, while Western humanism views both body and soul as limited by the conditions of space and time. And a similar logic attends their respective views of Jesus Christ, the one seeing his divinity in sharp contrast with his historical personage, with the other recognizing only his temporality. In short, the renunciation of history in Eastern mysticism implies a lack of concern with social justice, while the renunciation of divinity in Western humanism implies a disregard for any reality beyond history. Now, I contend that the spirit of both contradicts the biblical understanding of the divine-human relationship, as well as contradicting the experience of all oppressed peoples, who necessarily give primacy to their desire for freedom and liberation. Further, neither the moral ideal of asceticism nor that of pure rationalism meets the test of adequacy, since the aim of the former, that is the aim of asceticism, is to inspire humans towards the cultivation of a self-centered life of renunciation in quest of self-perfection, while the rational life of the humanist tends always to favor the tastes and aspirations of the ruling classes, whose interests it serves in return for their favor and patronage. Neither necessarily gives any measure of primacy to the good of the other being what justice is. The good of the other, which is the essence of the Judeo-Christian gospel, whose virtues of love, faith, hope, justice, and mercy not only imply community, but they are the basic marks of God's sovereignty. Thus, in contrast with both of these traditions, the Black church tradition in the United States and in Canada stands in alliance with all those who judged both of these positions as erroneous and argue for an integral relationship between the body and the spirit, between eternity and history, between humanity and divinity. In spite of their many and varied differences, the Black church tradition is able to draw upon such varied sources as the prophetic Christianity of Reinhold Niebuhr, the Protestant principle of Paul Tillich, the social gospel of Walter Rauschenbusch, the natural law theology of Roman Catholicism, the covenantal theology of American Puritanism, because all share a common understanding of God's concern for justice in the world, even though they do not all always put that understanding into practice. And part of the tragedy of our history is that many of these traditions have in the past contradicted their theological understandings by the shape and form and substance of their institutional practices. In various ways, these various sources have also been important important resources for contemporary liberation theologies in general, and for Black and feminist theologies in particular. To view Christianity and social justice as integrally related implies that those who construct theologies in abstraction from historical experience necessarily distort the primary source materials of Christianity. In other words, the Bible manifests a clear concern for historical matters, as seen in the two major events constituting the Bible's substance and framework, and that is the Exodus event and the Incarnation, both clearly demonstrating an integral relationship between divinity and humanity. The Old Testament opening its historical considerations with the story of the Exodus, and the New Testament being the account of the Incarnation. That is to say, the Judeo-Christian thought is thoroughly historical in its genesis, in its agency, and its form. This implies that all forms of theological absolutism are illusory because they necessarily deny the conditioned nature of all historical thought and practice. In other words, there is no pristine supra-historical knowledge available to humans. This does not negate divine revelation, but rather serves as a sharp reminder that God's self-revelation must be subjected to the limitations of human language, cultural interpretation for its meaningfulness. And that is the risk that God takes in revealing God's self to humanity. We contend that Christianity is in continuity with Judaism in many basic respects, the most important of which being the belief in God as creator and redeemer of the world, who, contrary to deistic thought, acts continuously in history for salvific purposes. As we all know, every experience of Jewish worship is an act of communal remembrance relative to the wondrous act of God, who in the beginning of their history initiated and guided action that resulted in their deliverance from slavery. The act of worship signifies the Jewish people gathered to reaffirm their covenant of being a special people imbued with a special mission of faithfulness to their divine deliverer through their religious devotion and habitual acts of mercy and justice in the world. Similarly, every act of Christian worship presupposes both the Jewish experience of God as liberator and also the wondrous act of God's incarnation in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, whose life of perfect faith, hope, and love led to his crucifixion, which in turn became the occasion for the final demonstration of God's sovereignty over all things, including death itself. And thus, Christian worship is always an act of grateful remembrance of God's liberative and redemptive acts in history, the availability of God's grace in the present, and God's eschatological promise of fulfillment. More specifically, the experience of worship in black churches in the United States and in Canada presupposes God's wondrous act of solidarity not only with the Jewish slaves, but with black slaves, by affirming their dignity as persons created in the image of God, when all others around them condemned them as a subhuman species. But the slaves could not commit themselves to Christianity in the beginning. In fact, it was 100 years on these shores as slaves before the slaves could give themselves to Christianity, because the Christianity that they heard and listened to was from their slave masters and from the preachers of the slave masters' religion. And these preachers taught them that obedience to their slave masters and obedience to God were one and the same thing. And that was not good news for the slaves. They could see no liberation in such a gospel. And so it did not become gospel for them until much, much later, until they were able to discern that God is the God of all people, regardless of race, class, or sex. And it was only as they were able to discern God as a God of liberation, only as they were able to discern God as a God of justice, could they give themselves in devotion. And that insight led slaves to express their devotion to God in song and praise, in prayer and testimony. And so their clandestine slave worship, because while they were slaves, they were not permitted to have gatherings by themselves. And so they had to slip off into the, they had to slip off into the brush in an illegal way in order to worship and to discern through prayer and testimony and experience what the gospel was. And out of these came the Negro spirituals, which were the religion of the people, written not by composers of music in any classical sense, but by ordinary people who couldn't read or write. And their theology is packed into those songs and the prayers and testimonies that came from that experience. Thus, clandestine slave worship became an alternative to the religious devotion of slave masters. And more importantly, it signaled an alternative understanding of the nature of God and of humanity. The miracle that occurred was the creation of new songs while in bondage. They were songs of sorrow and of pain and of suffering, but they were songs of faith and courage and hope, songs that integrated the experience of injustice with their faith in a liberating God. James Weldon Johnson caught this spirit in his immortal anthem of sorrow and hope, which has become the national anthem of black peoples throughout North America. Hear the third stanza of Lift Every Voice and Sing. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee, shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land. I contend that human beings cannot give their devotion to a God whom they view to be unjust. And therefore it is by definition that the God whom humans worship must be a God of justice, because we cannot give ourselves in devotion to a deity who wills evil for us. The substance of Christianity for Africans in the diaspora, what I call the Black Christian tradition, is expressed primarily in two institutional types, which often combine to form a third type. There are churches in which the dominant ethos is that of praising God. And secondly, there are churches where the dominant ethos is that of protesting against racism, being prophetic. And so the first type are praising God churches, and the second type are prophetic churches. And then the third type would be a combination of those two. These types are not mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, the logic of each implies that the other is secondary in importance. I contend that these types are not antithetical, but instead are complementary. That is to say that the strength of the one represents the weakness of the other. And further, neither repudiates the dominant emphasis of the other. That is, the praising God churches do not repudiate the dominant ethos of the prophetic churches, and vice versa. Since each tends to be correlated with an economic class factor general avoidance of each other frequently characterizes their relationship. From time to time, various sociological factors provide the occasion for these types to become significantly united in institutions that I call mixed churches. Mixed in the sense of bringing both of these emphases together in one. Many of the major historical black congregations in large urban centers in the United States exhibit this character. The most prominent of these being the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, long pastored by the Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, long pastored by the father of Martin Luther King, Jr., and then co-pastored by Martin Luther King, Jr. until his death, and the Olivet Baptist Church in Chicago, which is still pastored by the renowned Joseph H. Jackson. Now, it is the nature of the black Christian tradition to seek embodiment in institutions and associations. Now, in the context of slavery, the conditions were not present for legitimate associations among slaves. So the slaves responded, as I said before, by organizing secret meetings. And although these gatherings frequently aided and abetted the efforts of many to escape from slavery, their primary purpose was that of celebrating the goodness of God and encouraging one another through these supportive communities in which the principal activities were praying, preaching, singing, and testifying. Now, what I'm trying to do is to show how what I call the praising God churches are rooted in the slave religion and their orientation, which is where we are all rooted. But I'm trying to say that the substance and form of the activity continues into the present day. And clearly these meetings concentrated on serving the intra-associational needs of the members by strengthening their moral and spiritual capacities. And so these meetings aimed at the cultivation, that is, these meetings then, during slavery and now, aimed at the cultivation of moral virtues and spiritual devotion, the acquisition of which was thought to result from the inspiration received by regular attendance and participation. This objective has continued to characterize the ethos of those black churches whose members are daily threatened by the devastating constraints of poverty and racism, of psychological and social alienation. Those whose lives are being constantly diminished need the moral support derived from being closely related to others in like circumstances. And so in many ways, the black churches have been historically support groups. They've been more than that, but they have been the most significant support groups for moral and spiritual help to people whose lives are threatened daily by the terrors of life. The character of this ministry is largely communal in nature, and the people are helped and sustained by one another as they all seek to develop the capacity to face personal suffering in a constructive way. Acts of praying and singing and testifying manifest signs of the transcendent spirit that overcome adversity. in order to do these things in the midst of adversity is already a sign of transcendence. This community attributes its life to the grace of God, and hence it never ceases praising and celebrating God's goodness. These churches dominate in the United States and in Canada in the African American and the African Canadian contexts. Not surprisingly, the spirit of these churches provides the moral and spiritual foundation for what I've called the prophetic churches, which in turn often have more resources of education and finance with which to launch protests against those societal forces of racism and classism that affect all blacks in varying degrees of intensity, but more especially affect those who are exceedingly poor. The mutual interdependence and cooperation of both of these church types was graphically demonstrated in the mass rallies of the civil rights movement under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. On those occasions, the atmosphere was continuously charged with the testimonies and prayers of the faithful, the moving beauty of the ancient spirituals, the guttural exuberance of the Gospels and the rhythms that go with them, and the persuasive oratory of dynamic preaching. And all of this, having the people at all of the time feeling free, relaxed, and at ease, and able to applaud by standing or tapping their feet or clapping their hands or whatever. They just didn't sit in a dead way when something very exciting was going on. They were very much like, I often think the black churches often are very much like people when they're in the sports arena. When something is really going on, they just don't sit there and look, but rather they express themselves in all of the ways fitting for such a situation. And that has been characteristic in our church tradition, even though there are many of our churches that are becoming less so these days, unfortunately, perhaps. On those folk these provided the means, that is, all of these rituals provided the means whereby blacks were woven together into a harmonious whole, imbued with a common mission which they zealously affirm. And thus folk artists and professional musicians, civil rights leaders and welfare recipients, movie stars and rural farmers, poor people and middle-class people sang and prayed and joined hands, and they marched together in their quest for a racially just order. And all of that took place in the churches, the people gathering in the churches, becoming energized by those rituals in order to go forth into the streets and to demonstrate, to stand up and to move against the powers and principalities. And that those were mighty forces that met them with considerable resistance. Riot, helmeted, and armed policemen, water hoses, and dogs, and beatings, and many lives lost. And then these people would go back virtually from the battlefield where they never lifted a finger against the instruments of injustice. And they would crawl back, literally, to the churches. And there they would, once again, repeat the rituals and reaffirm their God, the God of justice. And then, as a sign of that affirmation, prepare themselves to go once again to do battle. And that went on for a very long time. And the conscience of the nation was eventually, reluctantly in many cases, impressed and moved. And many from other races and many from other churches eventually started making their pilgrimages to these battlefields to share with their black brothers and sisters in this activity. And so many whites were severely beaten, and many of them bear scars to this day, and many whites lost their lives as well. These joined hands with blacks and thereby expressed their belief in and commitment to the struggle for a common humanity. Their belief in God and their belief that to believe in God, implies justice. Not only God doing justice, but all those who believe in God doing justice, doing this vision is commensurate with the eschatological hope for the sovereignty of God. All of this was implied in that great I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King Jr., this century's most celebrated embodiment of the black Christian tradition. And in that speech, I think he summed up in a very simple way the eschatological hope, the vision of God and God's justice in the world, when he said that one day my children will no longer be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Thank you very much for being so patient.
Dr. Paris has kindly agreed to respond to any questions or comments you might have. May I ask you to note the microphone put in the aisle for your use and for the purpose of recording. It is not for the CI.
Should I stand here? Okay, thank you. I am sorry. Yes.
Dr. Paris, thank you again for coming to us. You're most welcome in Halifax.
Thank you.
I was surprised that it took 100 years for the black people to begin again their worship when they came to the shores, our shores, from the United States. I'm surprised that the black people, when they were enslaved in the United States, did not know or did not attempt clandestinely to shove the book of St. Paul's letter to Philemon in the master's offices or their bedrooms in the United States. And indeed, in the turmoil that we hear about South Africa, does not anybody ever mention St. Paul's letter to Philemon? Why don't they send copies to the government there? There's the answer, is it not?
First of all, I think one of the dangers in giving a brief historical overview is that one doesn't attend sufficiently well enough to the historical facts. I was not indicating that blacks in this country took 100 years before they started worshiping Christianity. Blacks in this country came with Christianity and began immediately, because they came with the Christianity that they had learned from the slave tradition that I described, coming here in the 1780s, and immediately building churches, and that is a story which is a very important story to be told. But what I meant was that in the 17th century, when slaves first came to the United States, around 1620, for 100 years thereafter, in the United States, they were, as a whole, resistant to Christianity, because Christianity was the religion of their slave masters. And why would slaves find good news in the slave master's religion? And that was the problem, and I tried to speak to that. When you ask the question about Paul and Philemon, I think I need to hear a little bit more as to what you are getting at there. One of the problems with black religion, I mean, not a problem with black religion, but what we've had to do was that the gospel for us is all that is in the Bible that talks about God being on the side of the oppressed for the liberation of the oppressed. And sections of the Bible that either might not be clear about that or might say the opposite, then we just don't pay any attention to those sections. They are not the gospel for us. They might be somebody else's gospel, but they're not our gospel. There are some people, not all, this is not to say that blacks do not preach from Paul, but certainly I've never heard a sermon, I've never read a sermon anywhere, I've never heard of a black preaching on Paul's statement, slaves be obedient to your masters. That just isn't done as far as I know, and we would all, most congregations, every congregation I know, would consider such a preacher to be out of his or her mind if they preach such a gospel. And so that has been a problem for a lot of people in dealing with St. Paul, simply because he is recorded as having said that. And Howard Thurman, who was the eminent, renowned black theologian, liturgist, black Christian mystic, he said that his mother told him when he was a child never to have anything to do with St. Paul. Because St. Paul said, slaves, be obedient to your masters. But
Dr. Paris, in that letter, Paul says something contrary. He sends Onesimus back to Philemon, telling him to treat him as a blood brother,
yes,
not as a slave, as an equal person in the eyes of God. That's the essence and the theme of that
yes,
letter.
yes.
So nowhere else is it shown so evident that Paul was saying that Jesus that the underdog or the slave should be treated equally. Yeah. That's what he says to
But can you imagine a slave going back and meeting his slave master and say, I have word from someone else that you are to treat me as an equal, and therefore I should sit down at your table or whatever, and that I should have my freedom. And the problem is that's a very problematic passage, because the person, both Onesimus and Philemon, were in a system, and this was not something which could be adjusted simply by one person speaking to another person. This was a political problem of how you do away with slavery. Now, I think that one could discuss and debate this in various ways, but my question is, what does that have to say about a political movement for the abolition of slavery? I would have been happier to have seen Paul say, now look, this is the way that you've got to organize a political group of, in order to bring down this system. You see, but that's me talking 2,000 years later. But that would have made sense to me. This business of telling the slave to go back and to say this to his slave master, it's even less likely to happen than for Paul to have told the slave master to go back and to treat his or her slaves as equals by setting them free, and then joining in a larger movement to set free other slaves. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I may be abusing all of the rules of exegesis here. Yes.
Do you see much difference between the experience of black churches in the United States and black churches in Canada?
At the deep levels, I see very little difference. That is, at the level of fundamental principles, theology, common history, in many ways, how what people preach, the sort of the life of the churches, the mission of the churches. I see very little fundamental differences there at all. The differences are in form, which are due to the differences of social and cultural situation, and demographic features of population size. Many of the vast majority of blacks are urban, are in large urban centers. That wasn't always the case. That has become the case in this century. Prior to that, the majority in the United States were rural. Now the majority are urban. And so that makes it so that it's those differences that come with urbanism, that come with a class structure, a defined class structure within the black community of demographic and sociological factors. But by and large, their relationship, even though it looks as if from a distance they enjoy much more progress and so forth in many ways these days, it really isn't so, because you've got to remember that there are 30 million black Americans, and that's as much as the population of Canada. And so when you see black Americans on the television screens and so forth, you are not seeing what is typical amongst black Americans. But the larger number, the largest proportion of the poor are amongst blacks. I mean, of the really permanent underclass is amongst blacks in the United States, still is. Blacks are the largest percentage in the prisons because the legal system works against them and it doesn't work for them. Blacks are the smallest number percentage-wise being able to gain entrance to the universities and so forth because the educational system fails them in the elementary schools and the junior high and the high schools. And so a lot go through the schools, but then when they get to grade 12, they graduate with a grade 12 certificate, but they are reading at 5th grade level. And so they don't have the substance of the education. And it's not their fault. They thought they were getting it in many cases. But the school system fails them. Now, one can say, the school system can say, well, the family, blame the family for it. And I feel that too much blame is thrown onto the family and not enough absorbed by the system itself. On every social and economic axis, blacks are not flourishing. And so Jesse Jackson's running for President of the United States should not lead anyone to think that blacks have made it into the mainstream in the United States. But the pattern of relationships is quite similar there to here, as far as I can tell myself. Yes.
You mentioned the integration between the praise and prophetic in black churches, and the place at which the black community stands now, both in Canada and particularly in the United States, in terms of justice. Do you, maybe you're going to continue this tomorrow, but does the black experience have something important to say in terms of liberation theology, feminist theology, in particular in feminist theology, the dissonance, I guess, between the experiential and the prophetic is one that continues to be drawn and not an integration. And I guess I'm saying a number of things here, but does the experience of the black churches have something important to say to feminist theology?
I think yes, and I think that is being heard in by a lot of feminist theologians, and I think Rosemary Ruther would be a very good example of someone who wrote about that very, very early, the very close relationship between black theology and feminist theology. Neither one is simply for itself. That's what one has to. Sometimes people think that black theology is sort of racist or it's just for blacks. And but it is what the theology that has come out of the black experience, and with its interest in and quest for justice for all. Blacks are as a whole bent against all forms of racism. And black theology is also. I think that feminist theology, similarly, is for the justice of women and the women's experience, and seeing women in a real way as equals to men. And the sources in our tradition, in our religious and our secular tradition, have all kept women subordinate. Women always had their place. Women's place in the world, wherever it was always a subordinate place. Similarly with blacks. Blacks could always go everywhere, even into the White House. All of the places that were the most segregated, blacks could be there if they were in their place. That is, scrubbing the floors and washing the windows and doing the menial jobs. But if they were to walk in the front door and say, I would like to have a cup of coffee and sit at the table with everyone else, then that was a no-no. And they were excluded from that because that activity implied that they would be equal. And now I think that while we have the legal prescriptions now for against racism, the de facto racism continues, even though it's against the law, and it continues as a residue, kind of cultural lag, if you like. And a lot of people just having difficulties getting used to the reality of blacks being equals, because one always wants to. The experience is that they generally are not in the society. And similarly with women, I often say to my students, if you go into a major multinational corporation and you are being taken to the president's office there, then every one of you will be shocked if you were to walk into the president's office and you found that the president was either black or a woman, because the expectations is that that would not happen. The expectation is that blacks and women do not sit in such seats of power and authority. And our religious institutions have not been leaders for justice in this whole area, but rather I contend that our religious institutions have been a major force in hindering justice in the sense of the equality of women and of blacks and minorities in the equality of them wherever the institutions might be. Yes. There I'm thinking primarily about some of the differences in the United States amongst the black churches there. When it has been correlated with a social-economic factor. When one has a church, a black church, where 90% of the congregation, however small it might be, is professional. They all have professional degrees and so forth. They are upper middle class. Then they tend to view a service of worship that has less emotion as being more fitting for middle class people at worship. And then they tend to, that's where one would tend to find it. Though I think that since the 60s, the late 60s, people are trying to get away from that to a certain extent. And this began in the university chapels, on the campuses of black universities, where in the chapels, in many cases, sometimes once in a while a spiritual might be sung, but so-called gospel music was not sung in the university chapels. I was at Howard University from 1970 to 1972, and when I arrived there, the stories were still very ripe about the students who had marched into the chapel and took over the chapel services one Sunday morning in 1968. And they marched in singing. I mean, they weren't closing down chapel. They were simply saying, we're going to have a different kind of worship service. So they came down the aisle singing, and they took over the service. And about 5 years later, the organist, who had been organist there for about 30 years or so, he died about 5 years later. And there are people there today who will say that he died of a broken heart because of that experience. But many people really didn't go back to the church then. I mean, it was go back to the chapel, and the chapel's whole life changed, and it hasn't been the same since. And that's true of chapel after chapel after chapel in the black community. And these were the university students themselves who were saying to middle-class blacks a prophetic message. They were saying, look, let us be genuine, and let us affirm this part of our tradition as well, and not try simply to deny ourselves in order to have a kind of worship that fits with our jewelry and our fur coats and so forth.
Dr. Paris, I know we're aware that there are different forms of racism in many parts of the world. The attention of many of us was called to the fact, for example, that there was a black Chinese series of disruptions recently. We've heard very sad examples of the Japanese not able at all to accept people of mixed race within their community when they're, say, black and Japanese. On the other hand, it's been also pointed out that in Latin America, the mix of blacks and the Europeans is of less tension and seeming to be more free of racism. The extent to which that is true, I don't know, but having studied with many Latin Americans, I think I've experienced that. There seems to be something to it. And my question is, do you see some kind of influence in Christian history which would explain this kind of difference, if indeed you see it as a difference, a kind of absence of the type of racism with respect to color in Latin American territories, as distinguished from, say, the thing that we're more familiar with in, say, Anglo-Saxon places?
Well, I think that that's a very good question. I don't know that I can answer it with any kind of accuracy. It is my understanding, I've not been to Latin America, it is my understanding that in many of the countries in Latin America, at a certain level, there doesn't seem to be much distinction. But at other levels, one will discern that the people of the darkest skin color advance less quickly along the social and economic axis. And that they therefore become, that there is a kind of prejudice which attends skin color there. I understand that that is true in Brazil and in some other places. Somebody else may want to add something to that. Yes?
I would just like to make a comment.
Yes.
Having just come back from the Dominican Republic.
Wonderful, yeah.
I wanted to say, to make the connection between culture and history, that when Haiti became independent in 1879, somewhat like that, part of the agreement with France was independence was also realized, but also slavery was to be abolished. That was with Toussaint. Then when Simon Bolivar was looking for help for independence of Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Latin American countries, in order to receive aid from Haiti, every country had to free its slaves. So I think the connection with the independence plus abolition of slavery went hand in hand, and I think because of that, the tension it wasn't there. I mean, I lived in the Dominican Republic. There is some that's certainly very, very minimal, but there isn't the thing. But I think it's historically, and I think one of the things that the Haitian theologian and historian context, that this influence of abolition of the slaves finally reached the American shores, and they give themselves that it started all in. And that but it also was a Christian experience because these people were really Catholics. And so that's a different angle that the historians and readers would look at.
I think it's always important here to ask of the question of racism and its presence is to ask the people who are the victims of racism. You see, and therefore, in terms of answering this question, I want, and the people whom I've talked with have been very few, but I've trusted their judgment. The people who I've talked with have been people who are black from various places and then their story is, yes, racism does function. It's deeply embedded, and they are amazed in the way that a lot of Canadians were amazed for a very long time that there is a race problem there. It just hasn't become a public issue. I say Canadians were amazed for a long time because back in the early 60s, large parts of Canada really didn't know that there was a race problem in the United States, in Canada, and they felt that it all was south of the border. And it wasn't, and that's a story in itself, and I'll mention that a little bit in a couple subsequent lectures. I think that I don't know the real genesis of racism, sort of where does it all get started and why. It's quite widespread in the world. I think in India, for instance, color is a very definite factor in the caste system. And that has been embedded there for many centuries. Why? So I feel that it's not just Caucasian people from Northern Europe who are racist. I think it so happens that in our context, these are the people who have had the control of power and authority in our institutional life. And that's the nature of the racism that I'm particularly interested in, is the public forms of racism, the ways in which people are excluded publicly from social and economic and political and religious participation. I personally don't care whether anybody's own private thinking about me is negative or not, as long as they don't express it in uncivil ways. You see, if I go into a hotel, I don't really care whether the person thinks privately I shouldn't be there or not. That's irrelevant. What I want is the same treatment of civility and so forth that is rendered everyone else. Racism is alive and well in the United States, and I expect in Canada as well, in the private sector. In the United States, country clubs and private associations and private schools and all of these sorts of things, if they are not getting any monies from the government at all, they can be as racist as they like. And but if they are getting some resources from the government, then they have to abide by the Civil Rights Act. But a lot of places decide to go it alone in order not to be forced to obey the Civil Rights Act. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would like to invite Reverend Joseph Mack to thank Dr. Paris. Reverend Joseph Mack is pastor of Cornwallis Street Baptist Church and also vice moderator of the African United Baptist Association. Reverend Mack has just been honored this week on the occasion of his 50th anniversary of ordination and for 20 years of pastorate at the Cornwallis Street Baptist Church.
Dr. Paris, ladies and gentlemen, the moderator of the African Baptist Association of Nova Scotia, in the person of Mrs. Carolyn Thomas, was out of the province on another important commitment. And that gives me, as vice moderator, the honor as well as privilege to come here tonight to express on your behalf our appreciation to Dr. Paris for this very challenging, inspiring, provocative in some ways, message that he has delivered to us on Christianity and social justice. Dr. Paris, I wouldn't dare to make any comment because I'm just trying to digest the depth and richness of the message that you have brought to us tonight, along with, I'm sure, I express the sentiment of the entire audience and staff here. Thank you very much.
In conclusion, I would remind you that the lectures continue tomorrow at 10 o'clock when Dr. Paris will address the topic, the importance of voluntary associations in the quest for social justice, and at 2 o'clock here in this auditorium on comparative struggles for racial justice in the United States, Canada, and South Africa. May I invite all of you who would like to meet Dr. Paris to join us now in room 405 here on this floor down on your, if you turn left, in room 405, and you will be able to meet Dr. Paris and eat and drink. Thank you.